We spoke last week. We talked about closure, the temporary closure or standing down of the workforce at Cigar Lake by Cameco. I think there's a lot of talk about the impact elsewhere in the world with other uranium producers. Can you give us a little bit of insight and maybe start with your home territory, Australia? What's the impact been there?
Yeah, so for everyone in your audience, Australia is the third largest producer of uranium, predominantly from the giant Olympic Dam, which is a copper then gold mine. So uranium is a little bit of a byproduct there, but because of the pure sheer scale of that operation, it still pushes a large number of pounds into the sector. We haven't seen disruption there yet, but what we are starting to see is border closures. So initially soft border closures by South Australia, where that project is located, also Northern Territory, where the Ranger mine is located. And now in Western Australia, we've seen a hard border closure. So as of next Sunday, even fly-in, fly-out workers for Western Australia's mining industry can't just simply come in and out, even with all of the mitigations that the mines had in place with charter flights, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's to a large extent setting the standard. And I would expect it's likely that South Australia would follow suit. So we are seeing a level of disruption already. Olympic Dam relies on a large component of fly-in, fly-out workers. No signs yet of a closure, but as I said in the article, I think COVID-19 is going to nibble at the edges of efficiency for all mines, including Olympic Dam. So I'd expect them to be below production guidance there. And the question is it 5 or 10% below production guidance, or will they have to close down for a period of time? And we're not seeing the indications of that yet.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So what is happening with regards to COVID-19 elsewhere, because most countries have identified key workers, and some countries, like if you look at Canada, with the provinces have different views of what key workers are. Some of those are mining personnel, and in other provinces, they're not. What's the story in Australia? Because you used the phrase nibble away at production, and I get that it's a byproduct as such, and I do want to talk about that specifically, but surely this is going to be a major disruption to BHP's operations.
And that's important to understand, because if we're going to try and game BHP's decisions at Olympic Dam, what they are and aren't prepared to do, what their risk tolerance is, you need to understand their main game plan, which is iron ore mining in Western Australia. Western Australia sees it very much as an essential industry, and closing its borders potentially for 6 months or more, I think government strategy there is to use the mining sector to power out of this and manage to maintain revenues, particularly royalty revenues to the state. So for both BHP and Rio Tinto, very important to keep those iron ore mines going. There's a good prospect that Vale will stumble in Brazil, and that will lead to support in iron ore prices at a time when China will be implementing stimulus measures, which one would presume, with factories turning on and so forth, to maintain the demand for iron ore.
Okay.
So for Western Australia, it's very important. South Australia is quite similar. And my take on it is that BHP at Olympic Dam and Rio Tinto at Ranger mine in the Northern Territory will be very reluctant to do anything there that could endanger the broader iron ore operations and their continued stability in this crisis.
Okay, well, let me understand that, because let me understand the practicalities of that. So they want to encourage BHP to continue mining there. It's important for revenues, but with staff flying in and out, obviously that will cause problems, or their lack of ability to fly in and out, it will cause problems. So what do? Do you keep your staff on site and say, right, you're not allowed to leave? Or do you have to rely on local staff? Or is it testing? I mean, we have had CEOs come on and talk about, we test people's temperature before they walk in. But obviously I think that's fairly debunked as a control method to understand whether someone's a carrier or not.
So they're doing all of the above pretty much. What we are seeing is there's a scramble to relocate fly-in, fly-out workers and their families into Western Australia. The hard border closure is from Sunday. They'll need to go into 14-day quarantine, but then they'll be inside the state. They're obviously doing mitigations on site to the extent that they can. The advantage that we've got in Western Australia is we still haven't seen any level of community transmission. So transmissivity here has all been from overseas travel, cruise ships, and direct contact with people in that situation. So it's reasonable to expect that once the borders are closed and you see continued evidence of that lack of community transmission, that the mitigations on site will be reasonable. So then that brings us to South Australia, and they don't have quite the same sort of emphasis on a large Pilbara-based iron ore industry. Olympic Dam is important to South Australia. There's no question about that. So there will be pressure to maintain Olympic Dam. But again, going to BHP's risk profile, if they have an outbreak at Olympic Dam, it's hard to see them just isolating the particular crew that had contact and carrying on as business as usual. You'd see some level of disruption there.
Okay. That makes sense to me, and I think for viewers watching this, trying to understand how different countries are approaching this and the seriousness to which they're obviously attributing this is really important. Can we talk about that byproduct, which is uranium? That's why we're here. We want to understand, do you think there is going to be a major disruption to the uranium supply from Australia as a result of this, or do you think, to use your phrase, the margins may be nibbled away at, but it should be able to continue to supply into the market?
I think it'll be annualised disruption from Australian production in the order of 5 to 10%.
Okay.
So not enormous. They're pounds that count though, because Olympic Dam does not manage their marketing of uranium. They sell into the spot market. And quite often from a lot of criticism from other producers that they just simply effectively dump them into the spot market. So any reduction in Olympic Dam's output will be disproportionately helpful to the market rather than another producer like Cameco, who are very, very careful as to how they release their pounds, and they're all into long-term contracts anyway. But I'm working on, say, 4 weeks total production, or 8% disruption annualised for 2020 as a realistic scenario from Olympic Dam.
Well, let's come on to that in a minute, because I do want to talk to you about maybe, as an aggregate, what that number could look like. So we'll come back to that. So let's talk about your second home, which is Namibia. Now, so reports have come out this week and last about the Namibian government's actions as it affects miners. So what have you seen? What have you heard? Is that going to be cause for concern?
So firstly, the reports that came out from Bloomberg, Reuters, etc., that were then reproduced quite widely, took let's say a slightly simplistic view of the situation, and I don't blame them for that. There was quite a lot of confusion on the ground. I spent a fair proportion of this week on Chamber of Mines conference calls and that type of thing, and that was one of the issues that some of the other miners were facing in other commodities, the perception and what it was doing to share prices. What the government asked the mines to do was to operate on minimal operations and or care and maintenance. And after a flurry of clarifications, it seems to be that means minimal operations to maintain the viability of the mine, so that when those initially 21-day shutdown period comes to an end, they can then, we hope, power out of the situation and continue to provide revenue to the economy. If you look at the backdrop in Namibia, mining is incredibly important to Namibia. And it's very difficult to see where else Namibia will be able to get near-term revenue flows to fund their medical facilities and fund everything else that they're going to need to do, both in the short and the medium term as they come out. So I think what we'll see is a very big push from the mining sector and certain segments of government to find a way where they can legitimately trade off the economic benefits from mining with the health risks of further transmissivity and so on.
Okay.
Now, then if we bring that back to uranium, what's interesting though is both of the uranium operations in Namibia, the giants at Rossing and Husab, they're owned by state-owned enterprises, Chinese state-owned enterprises. So CGN in the case of Husab and CNNC in the case of Rossing. So first of all, they're not as acutely financially driven as other mining operations. So there isn't the question of bankruptcy. And secondly, they will be far more likely to do what government asks them to do, the Namibian government asks them to do. So I would expect to see perhaps a more cautious approach from both of those operations. And I will say in all certainty, we will see a level of disruption there. If it's not partial closures, if it's not reduction in mining and running a processing plant, it'll be difficulty getting diesel across the border from South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole range of things that are making it difficult to mine productively in Namibia at the moment.